Oh my goodness, Brooke.
That was fun.
You're making some great introductions. That was one of my favorite conversations I've had in a long time, and
It
I,
was
I,
really
I
good.
love all of them. But
Hmm.
Bob Hamp, his other half, Polly, we're going to do another one with the two of them. But thanks for making that introduction and co-hosting this with me. Bob
Yeah.
Hamp from Think Differently Academy has been tracking down some of the same roads I
Hmm.
think we've been tracking with fresh language.
Hmm.
He's a doctor, right?
Hmm.
Here, I'll read. Bob is a licensed marriage and family therapist, and Polly is a licensed master practitioner of NLP and Think Differently coaching. Coming together through different backgrounds, they have a common focus on recognizing the healing power of healthy relationships and a meaningful spiritual life based on Scripture.
Yes.
We went into some rethinking. Obviously, it's in the title of what they do,
Right.
differently.
Yes.
But we
Yeah.
did. So we talked about on the front end really what we believe about the nature of God, and then who we are, and then how that impacts us relationally, practically. It's in many ways a conversation we have on this podcast regularly.
Hmm.
But Bob brought some fresh language, some profound perspective. You know, he's a therapist, so he's a practical theologian at the very core of who he is, a relational guy who's looking for actual transformation. He talked about right brain and left brain in a way that I have never heard before. He used music as an example of how he talked about when you're born and how right brain and left brain work together in ways that I'm going to be repeating and telling people about. And eventually it'll sound like it was my idea. But right now, thank you, Bob.
Hmm.
And then we went into trauma, and we
Yeah.
went into how that works, and this narcissistic age we're in, and the fact that there's no hierarchy in the nature of God. Bob often took us back to the tree of life versus the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. How am I doing? Am I hitting all the
Yeah.
stuff?
You're hitting all the high notes for sure.
I'm jazzed because
It was
this
so
is why
good.
I do these are the podcasts. This is it right here. I learn through these types of conversations, and so I was just thoroughly engaged and thankful for you and for Bob and for this conversation.
Well, yeah, and I really enjoyed it in the aspect of sometimes I do feel alone in the way I think about
Yeah.
thinking,
Yeah. Right.
and so just having him come from the perspective he comes from,
Yeah.
I relate a lot to it, and I do appreciate the language he brought to it as well,
Yeah.
because I'm always looking for new ways to explain things about thinking,
Yeah. 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 And all of that from a place of freedom. I mean, that is, I think he started as, I've been known as the freedom guy.
Hmm.
And really that was the foundation of the conversation we had.
Yeah.
It was for freedom. He set us free. I mean, that is the invitation. Every one of us were created to live in this true freedom. And
Yeah.
so I think that will be the experience you have as you listen to this conversation. I'm hopeful for that. So anyway, hey, we have a conference.
We do.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about a few other things before we let folks listen to this podcast. And don't skip ahead of this part.
Well,
August 15 through 17. I always skip ahead of the intro. August 15 through 17 in Charlotte, North Carolina. We are having a conference, a Rethinking God with Tacos conference. Baxter Kruger is going to be there. Brooke Waters is going to be there. Dub Alexander is going to be there. Felicia Morell is going to be there. My friend Michael Wallace is leading worship. He's going to be there.
you're going to be there.
Derek Turner is going to be there.
Yes.
And we just announced it. This is releasing probably several weeks later, but yeah, it's already filling up in the last 24 hours since we announced it. That's when we announced it. So August 15 through 17 in Charlotte. You can go to afamilystory.org. It's on the front page. You can click on the information there, and it'll take you to the registration. And we would love to see you there. We're going to have a taco truck.
Yes.
We're going to have fellowship. There'll be some worship, and there'll be some panels, and a whole lot of community and connection.
And it's online. It will be available virtual. So if you can't get to North Carolina for any reason, It is available online.
Yep, it'll be live streaming, and then you can watch it afterwards as well. And then you can also register for that through afamilystory.org. That is also where you can give. We're listener supported and incredibly grateful when you guys partner with us that way. So join us on Facebook group. We have a Facebook group, Rethinking God with Tacos. Lots of life happening there. Rethinking God with Tacos Instagram. And that's been fun. And I think I've hit all my beats. I've hit all the stops. So
newsletter.
Yes.
Did you say newsletter?
I didn't. Sign up.
You can go subscribe for a Family Story newsletter, and then sometimes you might find out information before anyone else does if you're on that newsletter.
That's exactly right. Afamilystory.org. It's where you can give, sign up, or learn about the conference. Appreciate doing this. Brooke, this was fun.
It was fun.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for the conversation that we get to do this. This is really going to bless you guys. This is Brooke and my conversation with Bob Hamp. Yeah, Bob, it's good you're here. I'm so glad
to be here.
Honored to have you on the podcast. Brooke is the one who made this connection, and probably several months ago. Actually, she asked me about you several months ago, and I hadn't heard about you several months ago, but thanks to Brooke, I have become quite familiar. And so I'm thrilled to have Brooke here co-hosting again. Man, share a little bit about yourself. I know you're in Texas. We were talking about grandkids before this started and grandparent names, getting to know each other. But share a little bit about yourself and your wife, Polly, right?
Yes, Polly. Yeah, a lot of times she's here by my side, but maybe another time. We do so much of what we do together. It's always like such an interesting question. Tell you about myself. Grandparents, parent. I've got 4 plus 2 kids. So Polly and I are a blended family. And so we actually have no kids. We have adults is what we have.
Yeah.
And I live in Grapevine, Texas. You could describe my job as I'm a licensed counselor, but that so seldom really describes what I do that I usually don't start there.
Right.
In fact, where I'm sitting, this is where I practice. I see clients here 3 to 4 days a week. But that's I've always considered my role to be helping captives find freedom.
That's good.
And so there's lots of different ways to do that, and my counsel practice is just one of many. I write, I speak. My wife and I do a lot of speaking together.
Right.
I've worked at several different churches throughout the past several years. Really, my longest and deepest stint was about 9 years at a mega church nearby. Interesting experience. I learned a great deal.
Yeah.
But the whole time, so I started my private practice life in 1993, asking the question, what is my faith in Jesus? And my belief in the New Testament, well, the entire scriptures, but my belief in the scriptures have to do with my practice as a clinically trained, licensed marriage and family therapist, and searching for the intersection of those two things.
Wow.
And so in the 90s, I began this journey, both personally for my own journey to freedom, but also asking the question, what does this have to do with my clients? And what does this have to do with my work at the church that I attend and volunteer at? So there are many who would say, use the term Bob is the freedom guy.
Right.
I don't particularly use that term.
Right.
But about 6 years ago, that shifted a little bit because I did an online teaching about the dynamics of psychological abuse. And all of a sudden, literally thousands of people began to reach out.
Wow.
I've never recorded anything that went nearly as viral as that video. A number of people, you mentioned before you turned on that recording, you mentioned deconstruction. A number of people who've been abused either in the context of their religious community or abused in the religious community abandoned them. So we literally 6 years ago began serving a population of people who had suffered psychological abuse either in the context of church, by a church, or abandoned by a church in the context. And so along with kind of my pseudo title as the freedom guy, I've also become an abuse advocate.
Wow.
And those two tend to run parallel, even though I really lean on the freedom thing because even when it comes to recovery from abuse, recognizing escaping and recovery from abuse, freedom is still the central target that we point people toward.
It's good.
I want to spend some time there because a whole lot of, I think we're running parallel, and a whole lot of the audience of this podcast has navigated some of those abuses you're talking about within the church, and why they might even use that term, or we might use that term, deconstruction or rethink. I mean, it's in your title. There's a whole lot that parallels. You have Think Differently Academy. So there's some rethinking that you were inviting people into all the time. I listened to a message I think you gave several years ago, and you said there's three things that you focused on around freedom, and the idea that all of us are made for freedom. Every one of us was designed for it. The reason I'm bringing it up is because it resonated so much. I'm convinced that what I believe about the nature of who he is, it determines how I'm going to think about who I am. And then everything I do with the people in my life and how I connect to the world. And so a whole lot of what happens here is let's get a better perspective on who God is as Jesus revealed. It's a rethink on him that then becomes a rethink on me that is actually then transformative and leads me into this life of freedom. So maybe start with freedom and the longing and who we are. Kind of share a little bit about what you've discovered there.
Yeah, you had me at rethinking, just because, and in fact, I'm not going to try to one-up you, but I want to talk about that because it's such a central part of the journey itself as well as the destination. When you quote me as saying we're created for freedom, the funny thing is Adam and Eve didn't really think about freedom, because they didn't think from the perspective of bondage.
Come on,
they only thought from the perspective of life.
That's good.
Adam and Eve didn't stand up from the dirt and say, quick, give me the 10 commandments so that I don't screw this thing up.
That's so good, Bob.
They stood up, and I picture them kind of pounding their chest and going, I'm alive.
Yeah.
And when the breath of life comes to you, the breath of life comes through you, and you live what we would now call freedom. But prior to Genesis 3, there really wasn't something to be free from. There was just a life in the breath of God. And so when I say you had me at rethinking, and I don't, like I said, I don't want to one-up you, but I think there's a really important part of that journey. And I would say not just a new thought about God, but a higher order thought.
So good, man.
We see in Isaiah 55, our thoughts are not his thoughts, our ways are not his ways. But he goes on to say, his thoughts are higher than ours. And a lot of times I think in our humanity, we hear that as sequentially better, like a 12th grader as opposed to an 8th grader, or a scientist as opposed to like a patient, but really a higher order thought is a whole different descriptor. And so when you say that my stuff is labeled Think Differently, the LY might be the single two most important letters in the whole conversation, because differently makes it an adverb, not an adjective.
Come on.
That's good.
To think different is I had this thought today, tomorrow I'm going to have a different thought. But to think differently means I completely changed thought process.
Love it.
Yeah,
I
it's
completely
good.
change the worldview of my mind. So I always teach we've got three levels of thought. There's the thoughts that we have. There's the thought processes that dictate that. And then there's the paradigms that dictate our thought processes. And so the phrase think differently refers to not thinking different thoughts, but thinking at different levels. And even at different levels, then moving laterally. So I move from one thought process to another thought process, or one paradigm to another paradigm. I move from the tree of life to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, back from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, back to the tree of life.
Come on. Yeah.
That's paradigmatic. That's not just thinking, hey, I shouldn't smoke cigarettes and I probably ought to read the Bible.
Yes.
I see everything through a completely new lens.
I love it.
And so rethinking God ought to also lead us to rethinking thinking. To examining thought process in such a way that we recognize we don't even know that we're caught inside our thought processes until for a moment we jump out of them and see them from a different angle.
So good.
And we call that the aha moment, right? And it feels like aha because all of a sudden everything looks different.
Yeah.
And it does look different because we literally just changed glasses.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I love this. I'm like over here just chomping at the bit because you're speaking my language, really. About thought process is my favorite thing to focus on. And I feel like the one thing that I like to do with people in it is it's about their level of awareness and their thought process.
Yes.
And I try to bring them from the place of where they thought about it, like realized what they were doing after they did it, to realizing that they have a choice in it before they do it. And so there's those 3 steps for me. It's like, when did you realize you were thinking that or doing that or X, Y, and Z? After, in the middle of it, or before? And I always like to try to get them to come back to the beginning of it, because that's where you're able to be responsive and not reactionary, and you're spirit-led. And there's just so much more power as a powerful person to make those choices in there versus, oh, well, I just did it. And it's just a different mentality. Yes, I love everything that you're saying right now.
The more meta that we get, the more power we can access. And so meta is I get above it and look down at it instead of being in the midst of it. So the more meta that I can get, or again, Isaiah 55, the higher our thoughts are,
yeah, it's good.
the more power we can access. It's not about the more power we have. We already have what Jesus gave us, but we don't access it when we're thinking at level 1 thinking.
Right. It's your level of awareness in it all. Now you just become more aware of more of the power that's available and being able to operate from.
And how to access it.
Yeah.
It's no longer down at this level. Almost always what we think is, if I can behave better, be more righteous, get a degree, be accepted by the right group of people, then I'll access the power that God's made available to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
The reality is we don't access it by jumping through hoops.
It's so good.
We access it by thinking differently.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, super important we say this soon, so I'll say it now. The word think differently is the literal meaning of the word metanoia. So meta, remember, the more meta we get. Metanoia is translated in the New Testament as repent.
That's right.
So it's always about not just thinking different, but thinking differently. If I change my process. So, Jason, you're a musician, right?
I am.
Okay. I just, I watched some of your videos. So you and I know then. And Brooke, are you musical at all?
And my kids are, so yes.
Okay. So you'll know this. There's multiple other schools of thought where this applies, but there's 2 different ways to produce music. One of them is you memorize and recite. And the other one is you integrate and improvise.
Yeah.
Those are 2 different thought processes.
I love that.
Memorize and recite tells you how well you can do what somebody else does.
That's good.
Integrate and improvise turns loose what's inside of you.
Come on, man.
That's so good.
And so when you think about most of how we teach people, and one of the things that people are so eager to break free from is a lot of discipleship, is we've taught people to memorize and recite.
Yeah.
Yes.
What does this verse say? Can you say it in the King James? Can you say it in the New American Standard? And if you've memorized it, can you exegete it? And we teach people a very left-brained approach to discipleship, but none of that turns loose who we are.
Come on.
That tells us how well we can mimic the person we learned from and the person they learned from and the person they learned
So good.
Yeah.
We were never created to be parrots or mimics.
There's so much freedom. I love that. I've always said I'm a right brain guy in a left brain world. I've never actually been interested. In fact, I don't know how to mimic. I don't know how to when it comes to music.
Well, good. You'll probably change the world then.
You're very kind. But I think you touched on the thing that burns in me, because transformation is what matters. When you say the LY, what you're saying to me is the term I use is I'm a relational theologian, meaning it actually is, it's practical. It looks like something. It's transformational in my relationship with my wife, in my relationship with my kids. And the greatest shifts in my life, the places where I've actually been transformed, not worked myself up or bootstrapped something or figured out how to systematize and structure something so that I behave differently, but actually transformed, where the things that I might have thought I wanted to do at one point, I don't even think that way anymore. I'm actually operating differently. It's where I've encountered the perfection of his love for me, the kindness of God, where the lens has been cleared and I see who he truly is, this greater love that I can have access to, that is an intimate, experiential, and I see that language in a lot of what you've written, that experiencing. And from there, it's the kindness of God that leads to repentance, and we are transformed by the renewing. So in my mind, I'm like, it is the encounter with the truth of his kindness that changes how I think. And I am transformed when my thinking's changed. And I remember as a pastor, and I'd love for you to speak to this, and I've told the story enough times on here that I'll just tell it quickly for you. I was teaching on the idea that there's no separation in the nature of God. And there's no separation in the nature of love. And so I'd mentioned that we aren't transformed by hell or by fear or by shame. And I'd used the word hell. Hell doesn't change us. And one of the women who'd been there for many, many years, she graciously and kindly, she was wrestling with what I said, Jason, I got saved because of my fear of hell. And I said, I appreciate that. I said, I can understand what you're saying. I said, but let me ask you a question. I said, those places in your life where you've been actually transformed, where you aren't the person you were, go back and revisit them. And then I had everyone in the room. I said, close your eyes. Let's revisit those places where we've actually been transformed, not where we're trying harder, but where we've actually been transformed. And let's go find the root of that. And I can almost promise you it'll be an encounter or a revelation of his kindness or his love. Mm-hmm. She began to weep as she realized that these were the places where she'd been transformed. Mm. So I think that's what you're speaking to. That LY that you're talking about is that. Am I getting that right? Am I yes-anding you in the right way here?
It modifies a process, not a. So if we think different, today I smoke cigarettes, tomorrow I try to pray instead. Mm-hmm. Right. If I think differently, I begin to recognize that God is someone other than who I thought he was. Therefore, I'm someone other than who I thought I was.
But that's in the wrong paradigm is what you're saying. It's right. A flawed. Yes. Okay. Carry on.
So trying to arm wrestle yourself into conformity is a paradigm that comes from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I overcome the evil with whatever good I can generate out of my own being.
So good, Bob.
And so that paradigm sounds so good in the religious circles. I stop doing bad and I start doing good. And we get applauded for that and we get put on stages for that sometimes. Yeah. But when it's generated from, like you said, either her fear or sometimes guilt, sometimes shame, sometimes the need to thump our chest a little bit.
Right.
When it's generated from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it cannot come from anything except me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But we were created to live. I always say, we've been convinced that we're supposed to live for God, and that's not in the scripture.
Mm. Come on.
What the scripture teaches us is we're supposed to live from God.
Mm-hmm. Come on.
God to us, God in us, and God through us.
Mm-hmm. Come on. It's good.
And the difference between the two, and I heard this in your language early on, Jason, the difference is the first one makes me an initiator.
Yeah.
Right? The first one makes me, I've got to do for him. Mm-hmm. I've got to please him. I've got to not tick him off. I've got to be sure I do the things to get inside the door.
Yeah.
The second one makes me a receiver,
to
use your language, I have to surrender.
Yeah. Yeah.
From a position of surrender, I can truly become who I am because it's God to me, God in me, and ultimately then God through me.
Come on.
But when I'm living for God, mm-hmm. I'm going to generate out of my own capacity something that I've conceived will somehow make him not mad at me or approve of me more.
Come on.
And so many of those things, don't even come from scripture. So many of those things come from our family of origin. Mm-hmm. We religionize them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So if I were going to go back and answer your question about the 3 steps, because I'm almost never a steps guy.
Right. That's what you said.
But I tell people,
I'm not either.
There is this thing when it comes to finding freedom, because one of the most significant barriers to freedom is chasing the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Right? Again, tree of the knowledge of good and evil is going to tell us that freedom is about not smoking, not drinking, not cussing. As the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is going to tell us this branch is evil, climb over to the branch called the knowledge of good, and then you'll be a successful disciple. Mm-hmm. And we could call that freedom and spend an entire, I would say, generation, but also denomination.
Yeah.
Also, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah.
Chasing the wrong thing and wondering why we never experience freedom.
Yeah.
So I put steps in place just because it's first of all important that the thing we're pursuing is what Scripture defines as freedom, not what instinct and the knowledge of good and evil defines as freedom. So the knowledge of good and evil would say freedom is when we finally get the bad stuff out and we start living the good stuff. And I always say freedom's not the absence of something, it's the presence of someone.
Mm-hmm. It's good.
It's not when we finally get the bad stuff conquered, it's when we finally get him resident in us in such a way that we can, again, language that I've heard you use, that we can experience that and not just preach about it.
Right.
And so step number one is we've got to get free from bad definitions.
Yeah.
If our definitions of freedom are we're getting free from something, then we've already slipped outside of Scripture's parameters for what freedom really is. So I think about, if we're going to define it scripturally, it would be like 1 Corinthians 3, that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom.
Yeah.
And so where the question is not, what am I doing, but where is God in me? How deep have I let him in me?
Yeah.
Have I only let him instruct me, or if I let him conquer me?
Yeah.
Have I let him overtake me? Have I let him in, and therefore in surrender to him, allowed him to take the steering wheel?
Yeah.
And in doing that, I'm free not from something, but I'm free to be someone.
That's so good. It's
So the
so good.
definition that I tell people, if we're going to change definitions, it's freedom is the ability to respond to God as the person he's created and redeemed us to be.
Yes.
It's all about identity. It's
Yes.
all about becoming, not performing.
So good. Yeah.
Step number two. Go ahead.
Go for it. No, keep going. I'm just going to listen.
Step number two is now that we define freedom as what I think is biblical, to become the person you're created and redeemed to be. Now at some point we have to wrestle with getting free from ourself. Right?
Yeah.
There's a version of us that came into existence
Yeah.
in wrestling through life and in responding to the experiences we've had that's not the real us. And then there's a version of us that in connection to the breath of God, in connection to the person of Jesus, we can become ourselves. And some would describe that, and I would be one of them. Some would describe that as salvation.
Yeah.
When we get free from our old self and become our true self, now we can finally, approach step number 3, which is usually where people start and usually why people get so tied in knots.
Yeah.
Step number 3 is now we can start getting free from the obstacles in our life. Get free from anger, get free from addiction, get free from compulsivity, get free from fear. Most people start with getting free from,
Yes.
and in skipping those first 2 steps, they're constantly arm wrestling and climbing up the 2 branches of the old tree.
That's so good. So good. I got thoughts, Brooke. What do you think?
Well, so I'm a crisis counselor and I'm an addictions and recovery counselor. And I've been in the trauma field for a very long time. And I love everything that you're saying, because in a clinical sense, it's addressing the behavior modification, right? It's like you can't just change what you're doing, and because you can only do that for so long. You can, your will or whatever you want to call it, and it's like, okay, well, I can create new habits, but at some point, what's going on inside of you is still going to come out.
Right. That's all change.
Right. And
Behavior
then
modification is just level 1 thinking.
yeah. And the thing is, it's like I don't care if you're smoking cigarettes. Let's find out why you are. Let's find out what's going on inside of you. And okay, so you're anxious. Let's deal with the anxiety. And then maybe you might stop smoking later on. Who knows? I don't know. But those things, I love what you're saying and all of that. And even your steps that you call, the steps to freedom or understanding freedom. Yes, and amen to it's all about identity. Because if you don't know who you are, then you don't know how to be. And that's hard for people. That is so hard for people.
And we spend a lot of time and energy asking the wrong question. I found the other day, and this is part of my speaking course that I do, but apparently the number 1 search question on the internet is, why can't I lose weight?
Wow.
Well, there's a question that even if you get the right answer to it, probably won't really give you what you're after.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the same thing is true with all the spiritual questions we ask. Why can't I read my Bible more? Why can't I stop this habit?
So good.
Why can't I? And so we ask the question at, again, level 1 thinking. Why can't I change this behavior? And we never ask the question, who am I really? Ask the question, who am I? And you've jumped up 2 levels already, because I am not the kind of person who's self-destructive.
That's right.
Can I have thought processes and therefore thoughts that lead me to self-destructive behavior? Yes.
Yeah.
Am I created as a self-destructive being? Absolutely not. Nobody is.
That's right.
No, you're made
Nobody.
whole.
And that,
Help them discover who they are.
Mhm.
That'll translate into new thought processes,
Yeah.
which translates into thoughts they've never dreamed possible.
the great shift for me, and we use the term that behavior follows identity. And so if you can speak identity into your kids, this was one of, if you get caught in a lie, well, we can talk about the consequences of lying, and we can explain how it's going to break down trust and how it impacts you later on. But most importantly, and especially at those formative years, you need to know you're not a liar. That's not actually the image and likeness that you were made in, and you were actually a truth teller. You were created as honest. And so if we can speak that identity into you and you can come into agreement with it, then your behavior follows behind. The word salvation that you used, I love. I often refer to 15 years ago, on the major shift in my life, as I call it a second salvation, but it really was the awakening to my salvation. And it really was what you're talking about. In fact, the language, the biggest aha moment in that was out mowing the grass one day, and I'd already had these experiences and these understandings and this rethinking on who he is. He had already addressed my false ideas about who he was, and then it actually addressed my false ideas about who I was. He actually required that I come into agreement with how he thought about me. That was actually what he said. He said, "You don't get a say in how I see you. And so from this day forward, you're going to start believing and thinking about yourself the way I think about you." So a repenting regarding who he was and a repenting regarding who I was. Now I'm out and I'm mowing the grass and I'm sweating out there in the southern sun. And all of a sudden he says, "Jason, Jesus didn't live for the above, beyond all you can ask or imagine. He lived from it." And when he said that to me, everything shifted. Everything exploded in my heart. For a long time, I couldn't preach it because people didn't understand it. But for me, I realized he got the well-pleased before he did the stuff. And my whole life, I've been trying to do the stuff to get the well-pleased. Like the entirety of the Gospels is all the stuff he did. But before he did any of the stuff that made him famous in our eyes, he was already famous in his Father's eyes and got the well-pleased that empowered him. He actually did it from his Father's. "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I'm well-pleased." And so now he's operating in his identity, and he's healing, and he's raising the dead, and all these things that, I grew up in the charismatic church with the call of God in my life. And if you didn't have some sort of evidence, you were constantly missing the mark, constantly trying to prove, trying to get to God. And I love that phrase, "from" instead of toward, or he's living from, not for. I think that's the phrase you used, correct?
Yeah, and you just use the exact same language about Jesus.
Yes.
It's such a natural and spontaneous way to live when we live from
Yes.
the truth.
That's
The
so
truth
good.
is, Jesus is the Son of God, came in the flesh, and the truth is, as born again people, he has also come to life inside of us.
That's it.
Live from that. Things that, like you said a moment ago, things we can't ask or imagine will naturally and spontaneously come both to our mind and from our mouths.
Right.
I literally, there are times that I'm teaching and I learn from what I hear come out of my mouth.
Yes.
Right?
Because I think, I never had that thought before, but it comes from your mouth and you go, yeah, that's, I think, the design. I always say we're designed to live from receive, contain, broadcast.
Come on.
Receive, contain, broadcast. And we've turned it into consider, decide, initiate.
Right. Wow.
Let me think it over. I'll pick this. Here I go. The opposite of spontaneous. There's so much second guessing and self-consciousness and fear and insecurity in that, consider, decide, initiate.
Come on.
But, receive, contain, broadcast is incredibly spontaneous. It's the improvisational mindset I talked about. We just turn loose what's inside of us.
Come on.
Jason, you said a minute ago that behavior comes from identity. I want to drill down on that because one of our foundations of freedom is a class called Levels of Change. And it's a rethinking the change process. Comes straight out of neurolinguistic processing or programming, neurolinguistic programming, but old school, like back in the 50s and 60s.
Okay.
The idea is that at the core is our identity. And who we really are is trapped inside or released depending on what we believe.
Okay.
So the inner circle is the core of who we are, the blueprint that God designed us to be. wrapped around that is the beliefs that have been so core to us from early life experiences, family of origin patterns, nervous system. Brooke, you talk about, your work with trauma. Trauma can tell us who we are, but wrongly. And so those beliefs that get wrapped around us either turn us loose because the truth will set us free, or keep us trapped inside. But then those beliefs set a thermostat that will always influence behavior. So it's identity, beliefs, capability, behavior.
Wow.
So from what I believe, my behavior will arise. And the dilemma is there's a lot of born again people who are still wondering if they are. And because of that, their behavior doesn't prove it to them.
Wow. Yeah.
And
So try harder.
There's a whole lot of non-born again people that are behaving like religious professionals and convincing themselves that they're born again because they're doing the things.
Right.
So the dilemma is those beliefs translate what's in us into reality, into experience, I should say.
Yes.
So good. I got to listen to that. I listened to you have 4 or 5 in your Freedom series?
There's 6 now. It grows over time.
Well, Hearing God and then the Kingdom is the Kingdom's the last one. Is there one after that? Or is that the last one? Maybe I'm just wrong on the numbers.
They're designed to be somewhat circular. So depending on which set, there's not really a first, second, third. There's one that starts with, I'll tell you the current iteration. There's a class called Prisoner Thinking and the Problem Jesus Came to Solve. It's a re-examination of Genesis 3. It's some of what we talked about early, just recognizing that, we think Jesus came to solve the problem of bad people or good people misbehaving or bad people being bad, instead of the idea that he came to help dead people be alive. The whole teaching is just helping people shift their understanding of Genesis 3 and what a Genesis 4 mind does to our understanding of religious thought. So that's number 1. Prisoner Thinking, the Problem Jesus Came to Solve. By the way, these are available on Think Differently Academy.
Yeah.
Subscribers get access to the entire freedom pathway, including these 6 classes called the Foundations of Freedom. The second one is a parable called the Kingdom Parable. It's a story that starts and finishes my first book called Think Differently, Live Differently. And it's a story about an acrobat who's born to the 2 greatest acrobats in the world and then lost at birth, found and raised by farmers.
That is a phenomenal one, just by the way you did the parable in that. It was very, I was just captivated by the whole story, and you did an excellent job in that with identity and all of that. I think that just to say that, it was really well done. Thank you.
People ask where that story came from. I literally woke up with it in my brain one day.
Yeah.
So I can't even really take credit for it. I woke up with the story kind of rattling around in my brain.
You could kept quiet and not said anything. Yeah. So.
But I can't really do that. I don't know if you've noticed that yet. It's really hard for me to keep quiet. My wife said, how long are you going to be podcasting this morning? I said, probably an hour. I said, looks like sometimes they go an hour and a half. She said, we'll go an hour and a half. No. Anyway.
So the third one?
The third one is then Levels of Change, which if you watch those 2 together, the parable and Levels of Change, it's a right brain, left brain version of the same teaching.
That's good.
So the parable says to the right brain what Levels of Change says to the left brain. When you put them together, that process of freedom and transformation becomes a whole brain paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Then I think after that is Hearing God, Kingdom of God.
That's the last one I have.
And then there's one called Life in the Kingdom.
Okay, I'll have to find that one.
So it's out there somewhere. You can find it on YouTube for free. I shouldn't tell people that, but you can also get the newest version, like I said, on Think Differently Academy with the subscription.
Okay.
And you can get a free subscription for a couple of days if you have time to go through all those in 3 days' time.
Oh, they're worth it. Definitely look them up.
The Kingdom was another giant paradigm shift for me. And Jason, it reminds me of the way you described your paradigm shifting encounter.
Yeah.
Because I had really begun pursuing trying to weed out the crazies from the who's effective at spiritual gifts and seeing the power of God expressed without being a weirdo.
Right.
And in the midst of searching through and sorting through that, I began to see that a lot of the teachers that I looked up to taught about the kingdom.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, I don't really understand the kingdom. I really honestly don't understand the kingdom.
Yeah.
And the Lord said, go back and read the Gospels and pretend you've never read them before.
But he did.
Which is really hard to do, especially
Sure.
if you read them and taught them.
Sure.
You know them until you realize how much you don't know them.
Yeah.
And what I realized going through them this way was the only thing Jesus ever talked about was the kingdom.
Yeah.
Everything was either a setup to demonstrate the kingdom,
Yeah.
a demonstration of the kingdom, or an explanation of the kingdom.
That's
Yeah.
good.
That's
so good.
all he did, and that's all he talked about.
Yeah.
But I kept thinking, how could I read this and not know that? And I started to realize that the kingdom is this always present attribute of God that says, I am nearby, ready, eager, and willing to respond to the human need, to the human condition.
Yeah.
That's good.
And so Jesus operates out of this clear belief that God is nearby and ready and willing to act.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
And so, no, it's the most beautiful thing ever.
It is. Yeah.
So we picture Jesus going around zapping people from this resident power, but really the power is all around us.
So good.
And he didn't just zap from within, he invited people into this realm. He invited people into this God-soaked arena.
Come on.
And in doing that, their bodies were restored and their sanity was
Come on.
restored and
So
their mental
good.
health was restored and their relationships were restored.
Come on.
Not because Jesus zapped them, but because they learned from him how to enter in to the presence and the nearness and the power and the love and the acceptance of a God who's always ready and available.
Come
So
on.
good.
It's good, eh, Brooke?
Hi guys, the Rethinking God with Taco podcast and community is having such an incredible impact in joining the dots up for people around the world. And my name's Paul Golf. I've been on the podcast, got to know Jason a little bit over the last year, and I just want to really endorse the value and the integrity and the grace of God that is working through this ministry. And I want to encourage everyone to think about how you can support this. Ministry isn't free. We do it because we love it. We do it because we're called to do it by God. But we want to make it possible for others to do that kind of ministry with us as well. And if you sow into Rethinking God with Tacos, it supports Jason, it supports his family, but crucially, it helps to send him and send this message to more and more people around the world. So I think that's a great investment. So I really would love to encourage you to think about how you could just help to keep the wheels turning on the truck, so to speak, for these guys. Thanks for listening, and God bless you.
Bro, thanks, man. I'm thankful. I'm thankful for all the relationships, connections, and I'm thankful for all those who've given. Rethinking God with Tacos is listener supported. If you'd like to support us, you can go to familystory.org. Again, we're a nonprofit. And I would encourage you to join us on our Facebook group. Follow us on Instagram, all the socials. If you're curious how to find me on the socials, it's at Jason Clark is. Otherwise, like, share, write a review on iTunes or Spotify. Tell your mom. We really are loving doing this, and I'm so thankful for everyone here. All right, it's time to get back to the podcast. One thing you talked about as you went to go discover all these different speakers, getting it right, maybe getting it wrong too, some of them I'm sure, but trust is my through line. And so in all things, and so where he isn't good, I can't trust him. That's first of all. And then if I can't trust him, I don't have access to intimacy, obviously. So
Yeah.
And so if trust is my through line, then even how I would approach those that we're teaching, because of, and I'm going to move here towards trauma in a second, because my own spiritual traumas in my formative years, I became very clearly interested in finding those that were convinced in the goodness of God. Therefore, they could be trusted. But I too had, once you have that shift, for me, then you start rethinking all kinds of things. And of course, I had the same discovery of the kingdom. The reason this podcast actually operates under our ministry called A Family Story. And the reason we call it A Family Story is because if it isn't family, it isn't kingdom. Because what I discovered was what Jesus came to reveal was a kingdom at hand and within you. Mm-hmm. That there is no separation in the nature of our God. So the kingdom's at hand, it's also within you. And if it isn't family, it isn't kingdom. Mm. And Jesus referred to the king as Father and brought us into a relational context and invited us to live from that identity, from that place of relationship. And suddenly, go ahead, I can see you.
Yeah, I love that I start itching. It's, and I hope you'll just have to tell me if this is bothersome at all.
Well, you told me already we have an hour and a half now, so I slowed the pace.
When I hear you say things, I want to like wrestle and push and kind of.
It's all good, man. It's
good.
I love this stuff. Yeah.
When you talk about that, there's no separation in the nature of God. One of the things that I teach is that if you really look at the scriptures from beginning to end, there is this clear pattern that seems central to his nature. That is one become two, become one.
Yeah.
Right. Uh-huh. So God, from his singular nature, turns man loose to be his own being, but calls him back to oneness.
Yeah.
With utter freedom.
Yes.
You can choose to, or you can choose not to.
Yes.
The one God, with no need to be, loved and adored, turns Adam loose and says, "But come back."
Yeah.
And in that invitation to come back, it puts Adam in that position to say, "What will I do with this divide?
Yeah.
Will I celebrate it and run off to become the prodigal?
Right.
Will I perform my way believing that God will be happy?
Yeah.
Or will I go through the wrestle of learning what it means to become one with someone who is other than me?" And then God puts that in Adam, where he reaches in Adam's soul, and the one Adam becomes two when he creates Eve. And again, he invites the two to become one.
Yeah.
It's good.
And so there's this constant invitation that the one becomes two, so that there's a free invitation for the two to become one again.
Yeah, so good. Bro.
When I teach about marriage, but not just marriage, even the whole idea of masculine and feminine, the male and female in the earth, there's this intentional separation that was done.
Yeah.
For the intentional pursuit of oneness.
Yes.
And you see that. I'm going to get kind of theoretical for a moment. You see that in the garden, where the garden is both material and spiritual.
Yeah.
And at the separation, at what they call the fall, the two split.
Right.
And yet we see that the creation itself is eagerly groaning for the revealing of the sons of God, because it's saying, when will the divide, when will the new heavens and the new earth show up? Yeah. When will the divide between the natural and the spiritual come completely together? Well, it's happening right now.
Yes.
Jesus began it with the invitation, with the change the way that you think, because the kingdom is right at hand. The two become one is happening in front of us. Yeah. But the fullness of that oneness still isn't quite here yet.
Right. Yeah.
And so we were talking about this, my wife and I, and she said, "You see it everywhere. Look at the Red Sea."
Right.
You've got the sea that's parted in half and becomes one again. And that's when it dawned on me. Because what was the function of the parting of the Red Sea? The one become two is about freedom. The Israelites were free to escape their pursuers once the one became two. Adam was free to choose to return or not return. Eve was free to choose. Adam was free to choose. Yeah. And so the one become two is about freedom.
I love that. Yeah.
But the two become one is about the defeat of the enemy.
I love it.
Right? When the sea became one again, the enemies of God's people were destroyed.
Right.
And so you see in that moment, one become two is, hey, you're free to choose, but pursue me. Yeah. Pursue oneness, pursue wholeness. Chase the things that wholeness comes from. Because in that, the things that have chased you your whole life and tried to take your life will be defeated once and for all.
Yeah, it's good.
I love the imagery there. what I'm navigating is the idea that if God is love, there's no separation in the nature of love. And
Right.
so what you're then talking about is that in the context of love, consent is the high watermark. That we've been invited. That love always operates in the context of consent.
Yes.
And that's what you're saying. There's this invitation. There's union with distinction. There's obviously two parts: invited to live, or three if we're talking about the Godhead, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But for me, because God is love, that's the thing you're running at when I say relational. It means there's no separation in the nature of love. There's no turning, no shadow of turning, which is therefore something I can trust, which is something that actually allows it creates the culture in which it is safe to consent. It is safe to live. Am I yes-anding you in a way that?
Yes, and yeah, you're like, there is no separation in the nature of God.
Yes.
The difficulty is he gave us the right to be separate from his nature.
Yes.
And then invites us to come back to a place where there is no separateness.
Yeah.
Where not only are we no longer separate from him, but my false self is no longer separate from my real self.
I love that.
My whole self is no longer separate from my true identity.
That's good.
But in the presence of God is the restoration of that. But he gave us the right to choose to remain separate.
Yeah.
And that's like you said, my wife always says, if you take away choice, you take away love.
Right. Yeah.
And so God gave us the choice. He gave Eve the choice. He gave the Israelites the choice.
Well, freedom is the soil that love grows in. I mean, that's what you're saying. It's the ability to choose. That's why there's two trees in a garden.
100%.
Yeah. I'm tracking with you.
Yeah.
Okay. I got a thought, but I don't want to step, Brooke, if you've got.
Oh, I'm still recuperating from that comment about the kingdom. So go ahead.
What you're talking about, Bob, then in the practical, again, back to practical relational theology, because you're in rooms with people that are in marriages that are broken or wrestling through addictions or all these false identities and these false narratives. I love to have the theological conversation. I've often used, I did the same thing you did. When I reset my lens, if you will, 15 years ago, I went back through this. I got rid of all the scriptures for a minute and just read the Gospels to reset my lens, to discover who Jesus was, what he had to say about the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and about us, before I began to go back into these other texts. And then you suddenly read a story like Abraham and Isaac and realize this is, and taking him up the mountain and realize this is an invitation. He had a false idea of who God was based on his understanding of the day. God invited him into the heart of that delusion to set him free from the idea that God requires child sacrifice, something that was culturally understood. And suddenly you're reading scripture and you're realizing this is everywhere. This is all these places where we had a perspective of who God was, and he was better than we thought he was. And he kept inviting us into the heart of these delusions to set us free. And that practically impacted Abraham and Isaac, because you never read about how Isaac wrestled with child sacrifice. It never was an issue again, because that's not the God that they serve. They got set free from that. That's the practical reality of what you're talking about when you're sitting in a room with someone and you're going back to their core thoughts first about who God is, because I know that's the steps of freedom.
Yeah.
Who he really is, then who you are, and then how that practically flows. Am I getting that right?
100%. Yeah, there's got to be a practicable step. I think about I always tell people, if you read a survival book on your couch in your air-conditioned living room,
Right,
while you're eating Cheez-Its,
yeah,
you're going to understand it very differently than if you're out in the 100-mile wilderness surrounded by wild animals and you're reading the same book.
That's good.
So you develop your theology contextually, what you mean to or not. And so if you develop your theology in a sterile laboratory, whatever that means, it at some point needs to come to live and breathe in real life scenarios.
yeah.
But honestly, so much of my theology was developed sitting in a room with somebody whose life was crashing and burning. Wow. Sitting in a room with somebody whose body was betraying them. Sitting in a room whose spouse was betraying them.
Come on.
Sitting with real pain and real circumstance and asking God the question, what does your word have to do with this?
I love that.
And, I love what you said a minute ago about how God used that story of Abraham and Isaac to confront a false belief. Because I think so much of the time people wrestle with the scriptures and go, but what does this have to do with, what about the God who allowed this and who did this and who prescribed this? And it's like, at some point, I think we have to start with the nature of God.
There you go. Come on.
As the way that we interpret the scriptures,
That's so
not the
good.
other way around.
I love it, man.
We literally just taught that in our Sunday morning spiritual growth group this last week.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about hearing God, training people to hear God's voice, the most practicable step.
Yes.
How do we hear God speak to us?
Yeah.
And I said, you have to start with the idea that we grab a hold of the nature of God as revealed in Jesus.
Yes.
Right? Hebrews 1 makes it clear that the express image of God is displayed to us in the person and practice of Jesus.
Yes.
So good.
And so if we can settle that, Jesus wasn't slapping people. Jesus wasn't shaming people. Jesus wasn't, even when he was turning over tables, he didn't harm a person.
That's right.
He confronted ideologies.
That's right.
Yes.
And so I don't think he was a pacifist, but I don't think he used shame ever.
No.
I don't think he used criticism, even though that's not true. I don't think he used shame-based criticism.
Yes, that's right.
I think he pointed out flaws in thinking regularly.
Yes.
And I think he invited people into a relationship that would foster wholeness.
That's good.
But you look at how he was with people, how he conducted himself on the earth and what he did with the broken.
Yeah.
And that tells you everything that can be known about the nature of God himself.
Amen.
If you're going to look at the New Testament or the Old Testament, you've got to look at the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus as the express image of God. So if I'm confused about something I see in the Old Testament, one of the things we tell people is go look at the original language.
Yeah.
Go understand the culture. Go look at the context. Don't just say, why did God tell Abraham to kill his son?
Yeah.
And assume that God wanted Abraham to kill his son.
Right. Yeah.
His ways are higher than ours, and his thoughts are higher than ours.
Yes, and you're using that scripture in the most beautiful way, because that used to be used to beat you up, to force you to do mental gymnastics around what the word good means.
Yes.
Instead of actually going, no, Jesus defined it at a cross where he laid his life down for his friends. That can be trusted. That's actually the sovereign definition of the word good.
Yeah.
Now I have the lens. So that's what I was doing for 2 years. I was resetting my lens. It was a Christocentric. Now, the hindsight, I have language for it, but it was a Jesus lens, or a Jesus hermeneutic, that made it so suddenly I could go back and I think Pete Enns says he let his kids tell the story, the Old Testament. I appreciate that the liberty in that language to be able to then go back and let's go find God in Christ reconciling the world to himself, even here in these Old Testament passages where God's continually inviting us to discover who he is. God, so
There's you said something super important. That is, I went on this search and I had this experience. Now I have language for it.
right.
There's actually neuroscience behind that. I saw Brooke get excited about that. There's neuroscience behind that, because the right side of the brain, you said you're a right brain person.
Yeah.
The right side of the brain for the first year and a half of life is all about attachment and experience. We've got that grandbaby who is in the hospital, and he's now 6 weeks old.
Wow.
And every time he makes eye contact with a significant other in his life, the right side of his brain is producing increasing amounts of convolutions, and he is learning in the most literal sense of the word learning.
Wow.
But he's not learning in the left brain sense of the word way. He's learning what it feels like when Dad holds me. He's learning what it feels like when Mom feeds me. He's learning what it feels like when his grandmother, who goes by Darling, he learns what it feels like when Darling looks at him and smiles and laughs with him. And that experience has no language for it until about 18 months to 2 years, when the left brain starts to awaken and starts to do this thing called label, analyze, and organize.
Wow.
First, I learned to call you Mom. Then I learned how Mom fits into my life.
Wow.
And then I learned how to use that to get my life to work.
Right.
And so the left brain, the way it works like this: the right brain can know things that it can't describe.
Come on.
The left brain can describe things that it can't experience.
Come on. Wow.
And so, again, when we try to push people towards left brain learning as a discipleship strategy,
Yes.
we're telling them to learn information that they can't possibly experience.
Yes.
When you've got Jesus who just says, there was a guy one time who was walking down the path throwing seeds. And when he threw the seeds, some of it fell here and some of it fell there. And the people in the audience are having an experience. And even the disciples are like, why do you tell stories? Right? And later Jesus says, not in the exact same place, but later he says, because I don't want you to learn what I'm saying. That's my paraphrase.
Yeah.
He says, because I want to confound the wisdom of the wise.
Come on.
And because the mysteries of the kingdom are made known to little children. 18 months to 2 years, little children learn how to connect.
Come on, Bob.
And the way I translate that, I would say Jesus is much more invested in the connection and experience of the Father than he is in our comprehension of theology.
It's so good.
That's that burning that they recognized on the Emmaus Road when he engaged every part of them. They get the revelation when he's in the house and breaks the bread. But they recognized that what you're talking about, that the inner burning knew before the head caught up. The head caught up.
Yes.
We
say all the time, if I could get it from here to here, but it's really more like from here to here, or here to here.
Wow. Right. I've often said for me with my kids when we were raising them is my passion is that they wouldn't just know the names of God. They would actually experience an encounter with the interpretation, because that will sustain the knowledge of that God as a provider is a wonderful knowledge to have, but to actually have the inner knowing or the right brain knowing that's you're putting language to things, man. This is why I love this podcast. I get to have conversations like this.
And language to me is such a powerful bridge.
Yeah.
It's a bridge between what's in me and what's in you.
Yeah.
And when you can find words for the indescribable or find words for what I've only experienced, but now I can say it somehow, it helps us recreate that experience for other people and in other people.
Well, and you see it in Paul, even when he says, I want you to be filled to the measure of the fullness. He said, the width, height, length, and depth of love. He says, now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all you can ask or imagine. It's like, I'm going to try and measure the love of God. And by the way,
you can't.
One of the things we tell our students is that real spiritual learning is marked first by confusion.
That's good.
Because when you get to second and third order thinking, you're having to tear down paradigms before you can rebuild them.
That's good.
And the experience of tearing down paradigms makes you go, what?
Yeah.
What? No. Like it really literally makes the mind a little bit cloudy.
Yeah.
And I always say, I picture Jesus like that's his goal as a teacher. That he's teaching and he's looking around to see who's going, instead of the people who are writing down every word, he's looking to see who looks confused. Because that's the mark of the beginning of spiritual learning.
That's so good. Since I knew we had you for half an hour, I really haven't taken advantage of you. But we have a phrase in our house, I don't know, but he's good. That's been, you name it, I apply it to so many things, disappointment, to my approach to scripture, to something that's happened in my life, and as good as Jesus revealed. So then I get to live in the mystery. I can say I don't know in the age of certainty. I can live confident in his affection. But you use that word tear down. Let's because a whole lot of folks who are listening to the podcast, for a while there, that word deconstruction kind of in the church became a dirty word. There was some shame put on attached to it. I realized early on, maybe just in how I'm wired, that we didn't get a say in being called Christians, and I don't get a say in what word we're going to use or grab a hold of. And that happened to be the word I like rethinking better. I like repenting or reimagining. But, I've done some serious deconstruction for the purpose of finding the cornerstone so we can build something. And so a whole lot of the folks that are listening to this podcast, they haven't, my last book is titled Leaving and Finding Jesus. And so what's happening is they haven't left the Jesus that they experienced, that right brain left, what you're talking about, that burning, but they are rethinking and in some ways deconstructing. They're rethinking Jesus. They're rethinking their faith. And in in many of us, the common denominators is because we've experienced abuses within the church. We've experienced trauma within the church. We've experienced something that isn't other-centered, self-giving love. You said that you're working with a whole lot of people who've experienced trauma. I would love for you to maybe share a little bit on that side of what you're discovering and learning.
Yeah. Wow, that's a whole nother hour and a half there, but you know, and I'll just say, deciding how personal I'm going to get. I mentioned that Polly and I are a blended marriage. I left my first marriage because of psychological abuse.
Okay.
And I had 6 different counselors tell me that before I would believe it.
Wow.
And those 6 different counselors would insist, hey, you're being abused. And I would say, no, you don't understand. Until I understood.
Right.
And at the time that happened, I was working on staff at a mega church. And so when it all kind of fell apart, I lost not only a marriage, but I lost a job and a church and a church family all at the same time.
Wow.
Now, I'll say I chose the divorce. I'm not trying to sound like a victim. I'm just saying I chose to get out of an abusive relationship when the church told me I should stay in it.
Sure. Yeah.
It's hard.
And sadly, that is one of the most common things that we see. Is, again, there's a whole set of theology behind this one, but there's this whole belief system that says stay married at all costs because that's what God would want.
Right.
And, I'm a marriage therapist by license and by practice, and I work hard to save marriages.
Yeah.
But I will not work to keep somebody in an abusive situation when the abuse doesn't change.
It's good.
Yeah.
I think that's 180 degrees opposite of both the intent and the heart of God. And rather than really take the time to unload the theology of that, I would point you to Gretchen Baskerville's book, The Life-Saving Divorce.
Okay.
Where she does some great teaching and kind of exposing the theology behind why it is that so much of evangelical Christianity wants to keep people in the trap of abuse. And then the teaching that I did on it was specifically why abuse is so misunderstood in general and not just in the church. But the general misunderstanding of abuse has some specific girders within the church that makes the church naturally a community where abusers can thrive and victims be double victimized.
Yes.
Right.
And when I say that, I'll simplify it, but it's not really fair to simplify. The way that I defined abuse is that abuse is the misassignment of responsibility. That the abuser is making their victim responsible for their well-being.
Yes.
If you don't cook for me, give me more sex, jump 2 every time I come into the room. If you don't do these things for me, it's your fault that I have these angry outbursts. It's your fault that I, drink. It's your fault that I, all these different. And so it's a misassignment versus responsibility where the abuser makes the victim responsible. Well, think about what would be kind of a typical church response to that would be to say, well, just go back and submit to him.
Yes.
Right.
Just go back and love him more.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of verses that they would quote that have nothing to do with abuse and everything to do with a mutual marriage.
Yeah, that's right.
But they'll quote those verses to say, you should love him enough to get him to change, which is essentially assigning the misassignment of responsibility.
Come on, Bob. Yeah.
And then within the church culture, there's a real emphasis on forgiveness with a misunderstanding of what it actually is. And so men or women who are in abuse situations are told to just forgive and keep trying.
Yeah.
Just forgive and keep trying.
Yeah.
When in reality, forgiveness really applies to past behavior that's ended, not to patterns that are present and ongoing. So again, to tell somebody to forgive and keep going assigns the very dynamic that underlies the abuse itself.
Yes.
So within the evangelical / church mindset is some theological stances that strengthen the abuse dynamic and disempower the abuse victim.
Come on.
Increasingly over time.
Jeez. Yeah.
And so when the abuser is an elder or a pastor or a volunteer, high-level volunteer, and the same thing happens, you see that churches And again, I'm going to say that theology leads to practice, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you'll always hear me come back to that tree.
Yeah, me too.
The tree is full of death, and every branch and every root from that tree is full of death.
Mm-hmm.
And out of that tree grows this same dynamic that says, listen, if the pastor has done something wrong, the good that he's doing outweighs the bad that he just did. So protect him at all costs, leaving the bodies of victims just strewn behind him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then they're secondarily abused by the leaders who circle the wagons and protect the leader who did harm.
Yes.
Yeah.
And by secondarily abused, I mean the assignment of responsibility.
Yeah.
Why are you trying to take down this leader? Why are you being, such a critical person?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you just forgive? You're hard-hearted.
Right.
And they're blamed for a pastor who rapes, abuses, controls, manipulates, uses physical coercion in a number of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
But the victim is made responsible, and the leader is maintained in their position until a higher power, legal authorities, or if it can happen in a denomination or a setting where there's a higher power, comes along and makes it right. Often, again, because the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, even the larger organizations still support the leader and try to, quote unquote, restore him,
Mm-hmm.
again, at the expense of every victim that he's harmed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you see this whole system built on the knowledge of good versus the knowledge of evil,
That's right.
and whether or not they outweigh each other.
Yeah.
And leaders are sometimes chosen based on their ability to run an organization, not their spiritual maturity.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Or their ability to captivate an audience, not their spiritual maturity.
Yeah.
Right.
Their ability to verbalize things well, not their spiritual maturity.
Yeah.
And so you've got this terrible kind of perfect storm
It is.
of people who attain positions of power who aren't mature enough to recognize what their power does to the people under their leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Jeez.
So that's really short and unfair summary, but
It was very well done.
Very precise, very clear.
Mm-hmm.
I love that that you take it back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because again, that's where the flawed perspective on who God is entered the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And the moment you have a flawed perspective on who he is, you have a flawed perspective on who you are. We're back to that conversation. But I've said often in our leadership, we've got leaders who have these particular theological constructs regarding the nature of God. And it actually empowers them to participate in hierarchies of exclusion.
Mm-hmm.
It actually allows them to other people to play the game of us and them.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as you said, I think it's so clearly, you've so clearly helped us understand how these structures get in place, because I think we're in a narcissistic age.
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
And
We've been training for it for decades.
Yes.
yeah, explain that.
Well, I heard one person go back to, and this is going to sound a little bit socially heretical for a second, but we go back to the civil rights movement, where as a culture, we made rights the primary focus instead of responsibility.
That's
Wow.
good.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And we know those two things are two halves of a coin, like the hemispheres of the brain.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Rights come from being responsible.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful.
We teach people that their rights are completely separate from that.
That's
And
good.
so we teach people, you can ask for your rights regardless of how you act.
Mm-hmm.
And it's become a cultural shift because
Yes.
that focus on rights back in the 60s, which was correcting a terrible civil wrong,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
but the focus became so out of balance on rights that we've taught people responsibility doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then every generation that's followed, we've kind of taught, well, you can have what you want.
Mm-hmm.
You have the right to it, and responsibility doesn't matter. So you have decade after decade after decade of people learning, I don't have to be responsible in this culture. I can get what I want.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Right.
And probably more reasons too, but I think we've done a
Well, and then
horrible job of teaching parenting.
yeah. And then we celebrate that. Go ahead, Brooke.
I was just going to say, in just the absence of the whole family, and look, I mean, my parents were separated, and I know my mom did the best she could. And within all of that, it's like, even still, she only had the tools that she had. And so but that absence of my dad for so very long created an absence in me that I needed to understand of who I was and who I am. And so that in the family unit, because I always think of the Trinity as a family unit myself personally, but that family unit matters so much about your identity. It matters so much because it's worked out in community and all of these things. And so in that, you're trained to be responsible, right? And to be who you are and all these things. And it's just like, there's just not, there's a lack in it where people don't realize they're lacking tools anymore. And I don't know how else to word that other than their awareness that they don't have the tools that they need just isn't there because it's what they grew up with. This is what I've known. Until you have someone else around you be like, I know there's things that can help you with this, you know? But then you have to want that.
Family teaches you how to ask for what you need. Family teaches you how to, responsibly live alongside other people. Family teaches you how to mature and not just bring a 3-year-old into a 20-year-old's body.
Yes.
And when the family's either not doing that or not present to do that, we have a lot of 3-year-olds in 20-year-olds' bodies or 40-year-olds' bodies. And so, it's a great point, the absence of the family. So much that we've just kind of moved into this season of, Jason, what you said, we're in a narcissistic time in our culture that self-focus has become a value.
Yeah, and we elevate those who do it best often to platforms in churches.
Yeah.
And I don't say that with disdain because I actually have great hope that there's a shift. The conversations we're having where we're convinced that he's good and he's trustworthy and are retraining ourselves to rediscover him. I don't want to leave folks. You walked us through how we got here. Maybe before we talk tacos, when you run up against someone who's experienced trauma, someone who's been kicked out, they've experienced the circling of the wagons. Where do you start with someone like that, or is there another 30,000-foot view?
Let me give you a global answer, because I wouldn't start here with somebody in that place, because when they're in pain, they're not ready to think globally.
That's right.
But I want to put a global answer in front of us before I tell you how I'd say it to somebody who's right in that moment. Jason, you mentioned you came from a charismatic background, so I'm assuming that to some degree you lived among those who've prayed and prayed and prayed for the great revival.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I think this is it.
I do too. Oh my goodness, brother.
Yes.
I think this is the great revival. If you think about the spread of New Testament Christianity, it happened because a ragtag band of believers was persecuted where they lived and had to go somewhere else.
Oh, so good.
Yeah.
And it pushed them into nations and cities and relationships outside of where they had once been safe.
Wow.
That's good.
And so the gospel was spread because they were persecuted in their hometown, not because they were great missionaries, but because they were being killed. And I think we have had this picture that the great revival that we're praying for is that God comes and we all go back to church and we all sing songs happily together and hold hands with, every tribe and every nation and every denomination. And as much as that sounds lovely, that seems incongruent with what we saw with the spread of the gospel in the New Testament.
Oh, my goodness.
And I think the revival comes when, I picture for a moment Ezekiel 10, when the priests are going about doing their duties and God gets up one Sunday morning and says, I'm not going to church today. And the priests go, hey, something feels different, but we're just going to do what we're supposed to do.
Yeah.
And God watches for a while and starts to realize, you're going to do this with or without me, aren't you? And so if they're going to do that with or without him, he gets up off the wall and flies away.
Right.
And so there's a dilemma that what starts out in the breath of life can fossilize into habit and it's pretense, but it's not pretense. What starts out with life becomes habit.
Yeah.
And when it becomes habit, it becomes generated from us, not to us.
Wow. Good.
And when it becomes that, it begins to die. And when it begins to die, it begins to kill.
Wow. Oh,
And so those who are seeking life right now won't find it in the fossil.
nope.
It's good.
And so they, by definition, have to get outside the fossil to find life. But those who are tasked with maintaining the fossil have to defend it.
Mm.
So they see those who are seeking the fresh breath of revival, a genuine encounter, a real relationship, a meaningful, invigorating, empowering of the breath of God.
Yeah.
They see those people and they have to criticize them.
Yeah, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think there's a revival happening that the church can't call a revival.
No, it's good.
I hope. Go ahead.
But what I say to the person in front of me
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
is I say, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're not alone, and it's not over.
Come on.
It's good.
There's some things you need to know that are likely to happen. You'll find out who's your friend, and you'll find out who's not your friend.
Yes.
And both of those will surprise you.
Yeah.
The people that turn out to be your friends will shock you, and the people that turn out to be not your friend will also shock you.
Yeah.
And you're going to walk through some of the darkest times of your life.
Yeah.
And on the other side of that, you're going to find real relationship with people who are loyal and connected to God and will connect to you.
Come
But
on.
you're still in a season of loss, and that loss is going to get worse, not better. But you're not alone.
Yeah, it's good.
You're not alone. And that's where people like you guys and the other communities, Think Differently Academy, we find one of the reasons we've launched our Sunday morning is because so many of our people just can't get inside the doors of a church without having panic attacks.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's what we're
It's
Or
hard.
they've been fed by teaching from the tree of life and they can't endure tree of the knowledge of good and evil teaching anymore.
Oh my goodness, Bob, you're
That's so
putting
good.
it so clearly. That's exactly what we're doing. It's the community we started online is just this beautiful thing, and it's that's exactly it. Anyway, we could spend a minute here, but
one of the things when I wrote my spiritual leadership book, I said I think that the church of the future will no longer be nearly as hierarchical. It'll be much flatter.
come on,
Mm.
Much flatter. There won't be the visible leader that everybody flocks to
That's good.
revile
Yeah.
and deify him or her.
yeah,
It'll be, I did some teaching at a church in Egypt, and I spent the last evening with the pastor of the church, and I said, typical Westerner, I said, hey, how big is your church? And he laughed at me and he said, I probably know what you mean, but you probably don't know what you mean. And I thought, are you pulling a Jesus teaching on me? And he said, tell me what you mean. I said, well, how many people attend your weekend services? He said, we don't have weekend services.
Right.
wow,
He said, the biggest meeting that we have every week is our Monday night prayer meeting where we have about 1,000 people.
wow,
That's
Nobody
awesome.
preaches, nobody leads songs. We just all come in a room and we pray.
Mm.
But who we are is we're doctors and lawyers and garbage men and teachers, and we're people who operate in this community who know Jesus, and we found each other because we need to have a fabric of family.
yes,
It's
And
good.
so we do two things formally. We gather on Mondays to pray, and we gather every quarter to equip leaders.
Right. So
But they
good,
don't have weekend services.
so good, so good.
And I remember thinking, that is so upside down
Yeah.
to what the American church thinks.
Right.
We're weekend service centric, and how could you have church without that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and yet there's still the gathering. There's still that sense of connectivity. I mean, it's happening online, but it's happening. What my favorite thing to discover through the community that's gathered around this podcast, and it sounds like what's happening with you, and I love these ways in which we get to connect. But is the folks that discover so and so 15 minutes down the road.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're grabbing coffee. I'm getting a picture. They're out for tacos, and that's the stuff to me, because there's still the gathering face to face. That I love that what you shared with folks. What you would share is that there is the other side, that there is the through, there is the faithfulness of God, and there are folks who are walking this out that you will connect with, and we're seeing that. And in greater ways. You're right. The phrase, the billion soul harvest, I think that was the phrase. and we're in it. I've been saying we're in the middle of it. It doesn't look like what they thought it looks like, but we're in the middle of a billion soul harvest right now.
I was going to say, what if nobody ever counted the numbers?
Yes.
Right.
So good.
So let me land my piece here, because I know you want to ask me about tacos. When I wrote my first book, it was about the personal journey to freedom. And the Lord asked me this question. He said, go back and look at what Adam was like before Genesis 3. That's your target. Learn about that.
Yeah.
Write about the return to what Adam had before the separation. So I start writing a book on spiritual leadership, and he posed this question. He said, what would the church look like if there had never been a fall?
That's a good question.
That is a good question.
Because we think about the church as the called out ones. But in Genesis 1 and 2, of course, there's only two human beings, but when there's nothing to be called out from, what would we look like? And I think we would look a lot more like the church in Egypt. We would be plumbers and teachers and doctors and lawyers and garbage men and architects, and we would find each other, and we would strengthen each other, and we would do community together. And there might be someone who can teach us something, but I think there would also be someone else who could teach us something else, and someone else who could teach us something else. But it's about the gathering, not the hierarchy. It's about the people, not the person.
That's it.
Good.
That's it. I love it. I love it. I love it. We had pancake church yesterday morning, we call it, out in our back deck. And my favorite thing about it was everybody had a piece. Everybody was sharing, and the hierarchical reality of again, if you think of him in the hierarchical context, you'll do it. But he's dealing with that in a beautiful way.
I'm jealous of Pancake Church because I'm eating carnivore right now. It's been a while since I've had a pancake.
Carnivore. It's good for you.
Hey, there was meats there too. We would have taken care of you if you were here, but it would have been hard because there was a whole lot of carbs.
Yeah, it's hard for me to resist pancakes.
And it's in the title, Pancake Church. Speaking of in the title, Rethinking God with Tacos.
With tacos.
We got to have a taco story, Bob. You're a taco guy. You're down in Texas.
You said that in your email, and I thought, wow, I'm in Texas. I know a week ahead of time. I've been racking my brain for a taco story, and so what I have a deconstructed taco story.
Great.
I love it. I love it.
Which I thought also fit with the theme.
Fits.
So my office is in Grapevine, and just across the street, just across the freeway from here, there's a little shack called Fresco Taco Spot.
Okay.
And they are, part of their thing is nothing's ever refrigerated. Their meat's not refrigerated. It's all as fresh could be.
Wow.
And it's good. And right in the early stages of 2020, they added to their menu nachos.
Oh, come on.
Like all they were was tacos and burritos and salads.
Yeah.
And just as the lockdown started, they added nachos to their menu.
Oh.
So not a taco story.
No.
It's a deconstructed taco.
What would be now you're not doing nachos right now, though.
Not now.
Just the meat.
No, 20.
But someday, again, we can dream.
Yes.
Yes.
And I do often. Literally sometimes. But so my wife and I were, they were literally starting the lockdowns. There was less and less traffic on the streets. I don't mean to get into all this, but I tend to not give into those kind of panic moments.
Right.
I was thinking to myself, I'm still going to go to work and I'm still going to do what I do.
Yeah.
And by the way, before the restaurant closes down, we should go get some tacos. So we go and we discover they've got nachos. I mean, this place, everything they do is delicious, and everything they do is, what's the word? A lot.
Here in Texas, yeah.
And so I thought, if they do nachos, I know they do them right. And so they bring a cookie tray.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
The cookie tray loaded with chips, covered with everything you possibly can. It's just two of us for enough nachos to probably feed six of them.
Right.
And my wife and I looked at each other and we said, it's the end of the world.
Yeah.
So we have forever called the nachos from this place end of the world nachos.
End of the world nachos.
Because when it looks like things are dreary and maybe it's all coming to an end, we're going to go get some nachos.
And everything's bigger in Texas, so that's on point with the cookie sheet of nachos.
So I'd like end of the world nachos with you at some point, you and Paulie.
And you find yourself here, I will find you some nachos.
Yeah.
Those nachos in particular.
I love it, man. I was in Texas years ago, and then we went to a barbecue joint, and I didn't realize that it was you paid by the pound. And I was at the end of the line, and so everybody's getting theirs, and the guy would go put his tongs on a piece of meat, and he'd look at me like he'd go to the bigger piece, and I thought he was just hooking me up. And so I kept being like, yeah, I'll take the bigger one. And then he'd go to the other. I'm like, yeah. Like I thought this guy was hooking me up the whole way through, and until I got to the end, and everybody's looking at my plate, and I'm thinking, man, that guy likes me. Thankfully, I didn't.
Is it one of those where they open the smoker and like the whole smoke?
Yeah, it was all there.
That's kind of barbecue.
Oh
right
my
there.
goodness, man! But yeah, they all teased me. Thankfully, I wasn't paying, so it worked out for me. But
Loaded up.
I love the story. Hey, Bob, how do folks find you? I know you're at the Think Differently Academy. It's tdacad.com.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the quickest and easiest way to find us. We moved all of our resources off of social media for a variety of different reasons. Think Differently Academy is our own site, so it's separate of all social media.
Okay.
There is a community element to it, and so when you join as a subscriber, you're also made a part of the community, and as a part of the community, you get access to we've got resources that are always live, and then every month we circulate another course. We do our Sunday morning spiritual growth hour, first and third Sunday. And so that's pretty new. We call it the living room. And so far, no pancakes, but only because
you can't eat them.
Well, I'm capable of it.
Yes. And you can make a sausage pancake.
You're choosing self-control.
Yeah. So Think Differently Academy is where all of our resources live. We also, for the last 3 years, have done a training for counselors and coaches.
Yeah.
And we're about to go back into that season, where we teach them our Think Differently model. How do you help people hear God? What are the models that we use to help people encounter Brooke, I'd love to talk to you privately or maybe publicly about that. But we do a lot teaching our people about what do you do about trauma. If you're really, genuinely searching for a connection with God, but genuinely dealing with real life trauma. And so we teach about I think we're going for 12 weeks now instead of 14, but a 12-week course on our freedom model, family systems, and neurolinguistic programming as a kind of a three-legged stool for how to help find freedom.
Wow.
And so, but it's all through that website. It's a subscription-based, but if people want to just check it out and see those foundations of freedom, you can do a 3-day free subscription and at least kind of taste what we're doing there.
Yeah, it's good.
I absolutely loved this conversation. I highly recommend folks check that out. I think I'd love to do it again with you and Paulie next time.
Well, she would love to do that, so I will mention that to her, and we can start whatever it takes to get there.
All right. But I can't tell you how thankful I am for you, man. And this was a powerful conversation. I'm grateful for you. Thankful for coming on the podcast.
But I'm grateful for you guys reaching out, because now I know more about you and know that the church is growing.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a pretty sweet thing. Well, good. We'll do this again sometime.
All right.
Thank you, man.
You bet.
Hey, guys. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast, myself, or our guests, you can go to afamilystory.org. You can also go to afamilystory.org if you'd like to give. This is a listener-supported podcast, and we are incredibly grateful for your generosity. Hey, we have a Facebook group, and it's pretty cool. Rethinking God with Tacos. You can join us over there. Lots of incredible conversation and community taking place on that page. And you can also follow us on all the socials, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and others. Hey, I'd love it also if you went on iTunes and left a review or shared or tweeted or liked the podcast. Let your friends know that this is a good place to hear about the love of God. I pray grace and wonder over your day.